May I have your attention, please?
Welcome to Real Gaijin, unveiling the real Japan, an American expat's inside look. Now it's time for another story from the Read My Lips series of podcasts. Summarized podcast.
Well, we're live in Japan. It's 8 o'clock in the morning, but our guest today is calling actually from Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States, where it's 5 o'clock at night, last night for me, from my perspective. We have a special guest today, Richard Handjaja. Richard, you want to say hello?
Hi, and thanks for having me, Mark. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, well, it's our pleasure. You have got quite a following online, and we're going to learn all about the business of the anime and manga industry and learn about Richardson's baby, which is Animenomics. I'm Mark Kennedy. I'm the host of the Real Gaijin AMA podcast, also the publisher of the Real Gaijin Substack. And the two of us actually got in touch because we share the same writing style, which we'll get into in just a minute on Substack. Today, what we're going to do is have an Ask Me Anything AMA session. So please use that chat functionality at the bottom of your screen to put in comments, questions for Richardson, and I'll do my best to monitor those and ask questions along the way. Plus, a little bit of housekeeping. We will be putting out a recording of this video within about 24 hours. So if you missed it or if you want to go back and listen to another section, you could do that at your leisure. All right, without further ado, let's just jump right into the basics here. Richardson, what is your background and explain your interest in anime and manga?
Yeah, so I have I guess probably in the U.S. a little bit of a unique background in anime and manga. I grew up in Indonesia, and so my background in what kind of anime and what kind of manga was available to me growing up is probably different from what where I live today in the United States. And so I have kind of a different perspective on, the availability of what kind of titles are available, what kind of titles are popular.
Mm.
And For me, I didn't really go get into kind of the modern uh, anime fandom until probably after college. So that's probably somewhere
Mm.
in around the 2010s. And so I didn't see a lot of the anime from the 90s and 2000s that a lot of Americans grew up with. Um, and so my perspective on anime has been, since the anime industry kind of exploded in the 2010s with the first boom before the pandemic, and I see, the growth of the anime industry from that lens, which I probably call, kind of the second anime boom. There's an earlier boom that I can talk about later too, but this is the pre-pandemic boom of the anime industry, and so I bring that experience of seeing what happened there, and when I was doing reporting about the anime industry then, and bringing that experience into what I do today with writing Animenomics.
And so about Animenomics, what actually prompted you to break off and do your own thing?
So I had been so before Animenomics, I was on the news staff of a website called MyAnimeList.
Mhm.
MyAnimeList was originally kind of a standalone independent website that's um, fan run, and so a lot of the staff members there are primarily, volunteer. Eventually, my anime list was acquired by a, a sequence of Japanese companies, and I was originally one of the news editors that was on that team when we were first acquired by a Japanese company. And so after that, I did news reporting for a while, learned about the anime industry, did a lot of reporting at conventions and stuff like that. Um, Before the pandemic, I left my anime list and then stopped kind of paying attention to the anime industry for a while. And after the pandemic, uh, I started looking back into anime and I realized, I probably missed kind of the mid-pandemic boom of the anime content. And so when I went back to look at anime, oh, it suddenly got very popular, but there's still really no one kind of explaining, the background of why it's popular, how the industry works, what has changed in the few years that I've been out. So I thought, you know, this might be a good time to go back in, to at least refresh my memory of what the anime industry is like for myself. I think it was a kind of a experiment for me to learn, okay, can I still take my knowledge and learn about what's been happening in the anime industry? It just so
And,
happened that I had just gotten married and had traveled to Japan for the first time in a few years, and
uh,
uh, I and was in being in Japan and seeing anime around. I was like, this is maybe something I should go back and look into again.
I got it. And by the way, just give us a perspective from the business side of things. How big is the anime and manga industries? And maybe if you could break those down by segment, that would be great.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, anime, of course, is more than just anime. Anime originates from oftentimes from manga, and a lot of times you have video games that are tied into anime. So there's a lot of different measures of how big the anime industry is. One measure that comes from the Association of Japanese Animations, which is a trade group, it's over, 3 trillion yen, which is somewhere around, 30 billion US dollars. And that's just the anime side. That doesn't look at the manga side. And the manga, can be, there are different estimates. There's not really a good comprehensive estimate of what the overseas market is like. But that in the domestic market, that's somewhere around 700 billion yen, which is, somewhere around 5 to 6 billion US dollars. So it's a big market. It's a growing market. And the export market is growing. Um, it, for anime, it's overtaken the domestic market recently in the last few years. And so Japan is looking at anime and manga and kind of all of the pop cultural entertainment content business as kind of a new export market for the country.
I got it. And by the way, I know we're probably jumping around a little bit, but like your original home country, Indonesia, I understand there are lots of anime and manga artists that are contributing from Korea and from China, probably from the United States and other markets. Where, I mean, does Japan have any meaningful competition now?
As far as competition, I think for manga there isn't really robust kind of comics editorial system like Japan has. Obviously,
Mhm.
there are, I think, if we're talking about comics in general, obviously the US has its own comics market, but it's a different system than how it works in Japan. Europe also has its own robust comics industry, especially in France and Belgium. Um, and for anime itself, I think there's a difference between what I call anime content that's, Japanese style and uh, media that's anime adjacent, um,
Mhm.
where, probably is produced in the anime style, but doesn't necessarily follow, have Japanese producers or follow the Japanese production model. Um, so there's a lot of places where that's being produced. But places like China and South Korea, where historically there have been a lot of subcontractors who work for
Mhm.
Japanese studios that are from China and South Korea, they're starting to produce their own works. And we see that in China, especially where a lot of the animators that were trained in Japanese studios have gone out and are now creating their own animation series and animation films um, that are to the kind of the Western audience. Maybe it looks like Japanese anime, but it's entirely Chinese produced.
Interesting. And what about not just the actual visual representation, but the stories behind the anime and manga from other countries? Are like, for example, I mean, China, of course, has a huge, long history of a rich literary tradition. I imagine they're drawing on some of that, which might be different from Japanese content. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I'd say so. The Chinese animation series will have styles that are some cultural elements that are different from the Japanese styles. I think we recognize for a lot of international viewers of anime, what Japan looks like to anime. The train stations, for example, how Japanese school life is like. Um, we see some of those differences, especially in those areas in Chinese animation. How uh, if a school life is depicted in Chinese animation, maybe they have different types of uniforms that are more commonly seen in mainland China rather than how school uniforms are seen in Japan. So those are some of the nuances that you can see, but otherwise, character designs, um, colors, maybe will look very similar to Japanese anime.
Okay. Back on your baby, Animenomics, tell us a little bit more about, I mean, who's it for? What exactly are you covering?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it's evolved, I think, the last almost 3 years
Good.
or so. When I first started, I wanted it to I wanted to write for myself, especially so that I could explain for myself what's happening in the anime industry, but also for people who have grown up in the anime industry, I guess in watching anime and want to be able to understand what's happening behind the scenes.
Mm,
One of I think the biggest misconceptions about the anime industry, I think, and it's through no fault of fans of their own, is oftentimes they take what they see in Hollywood, for example, and think that perhaps the Japanese animation industry worked the same way. And so there's this idea that perhaps the anime studios themselves have a lot of power in business decision making,
mm.
but oftentimes studios themselves are contractors and they don't often have a lot of say in the business decision making of the anime industry. And so that's the kind of stuff that I want to be able to explain to someone who's have been watching anime for years and years, and but now want to be able to understand, well, what's happening behind the scenes. Well, in the credits of an anime, why are certain people listed, why are certain companies listed, etc. um,
Oh,
so that's how I started. Over the last 3 years, I've realized that um, there's a small but growing set of readers that are from within the industry. That
mm,
maybe that they work in the industry, so they know how the industry works. But there's just so many things that are happening within the industry. It's hard to keep updated on everything that's happening around them. And so I want kind of the newsletter to be a way to bring highlights of stories that are from throughout the industry and say, okay, here are maybe the things that I think are important and stuff that is maybe trending that, could be a sign of things to come.
okay. And for the uninitiated like me, I mean, just a casual consumer reader of anime and manga, I mean, which entities, which firms are the movers and shakers that kind of command the industry as a whole?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I kind of grouped the companies in the anime industry into three categories. One is obviously the studios that
Mm,
animate and does the scripts, does the animation, does the backgrounds. Those are the companies that are most visible um to viewers, to audiences, because they're the ones that make the content that you see on screens. um Behind them there's a group called the production committee. In Japanese is the seisaku inkai. Um and we see that often. It's not unique to the anime industry. The Seisaku Inkai, the production committee, occurs in the film industry as well in Japan. in television as well. So it's not unique to anime. These are the kind of the producers who get together and pool money together so that they can invest in anime, have the rights, they control the copyrights of the anime title that they're producing. Um, then the producers, once they pool the money together, they negotiate to be able to distribute who has the rights for merchandising, who has the rights to sell streaming, etc. Then they go out and perhaps commission a studio to make the work that's going to be made. From there, then you have the third group of companies that are the licensees, where the production committee will go out and negotiate with these licensees and say, hey, do you want to market this product, or do you want to produce a merchandise, a character figurine out of the characters for this series? Um, or the licensees themselves will reach out to the production committee and say, hey, I want to do an
Oh,
advertisement campaign for my product using this character from this anime. That happens quite often as well in Japan. So those are kind of the three companies um, that are important for me that I think is important for people to look at. Um, the studios, these are names like Studio Mappa, that's common and produces a lot of anime titles today. There are, other studios like A1 Pictures, Cloverworks, that does some of the big titles uh, that are produced today. And you have, you know, h- studios that have been around for decades, like Production IG and Bones. Production IG was the studio that made Ghost in the Shell, for example. So those are the names of the studios, and then you have the producers. These are oftentimes companies that are under big entertainment names like Aniplex, which is owned by Sony Music. You have Kadokawa, which is a Japanese publishing giant, and then you have random publishers that are out there that maybe the ordinary non-Japanese person has never heard of. Maybe they do something entirely outside of publishing or animation. Recently, there was um, a Japanese industrial equipment manufacturer out of Osaka that started investing in anime because they wanted to kind of refresh their image. Um, and so that's one of the unique examples of a producer coming in from outside of the industry. And
all
then you
right.
have
Go ahead.
a lot for distributors like Good Smile
Mm,
Company that makes a lot of
ah.
figurines of characters for the anime characters. So
And with regards to the market dynamics, as you described, these three big players or groups of categories of players, I mean, given the internet and how distribution models are evolving, is there a disintermediation in the industry, or do these three major components of these three groups kind of stake out their own turf and keep others from, vertically integrating?
historically, there's obviously a lot of separation, but I think in the last, I'd say 10, 15 years, there have been a lot of moves towards more integration. Um, we see this especially in companies like um, the big entertainment conglomerates like Sony and Kadokawa and Toho. Those are some of the three of the ones that I pay attention to the most. Sony for the obvious reason that they own Aniplex, and which is one of the largest producers of anime today, but also they also own Crunchyroll, which is the
Uh,
largest anime streaming service that globally today. Um, Toho, them being, they're not as big of a name outside of Japan, but people would know them for being, the makers of Godzilla. But they have they're big and growing anime business, and they own a lot of theaters and movie theaters in Japan, and that's why they're investing more in anime films. And then Kadokawa, them being a publisher, which is a different beast because now they publish things like manga and light novels, and so they control the original intellectual property that an anime might be based on. And so they are then now going to acquire foreign distributors, foreign publishers as subsidiaries, so that they can publish those works abroad. They've also acquired animation studios that they could learn from and perhaps bring them in as potential partners if they want to adapt one of their manga titles into anime.
Got it. And how about like which one of these three big groups of companies is just dominant or heading in that direction? In other words, is the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, with a smaller firm getting more leverage over a traditionally strong distribution channel? Or am I reading too much into this?
No, I think that's a good question. So historically, studios have had a lot of power. In
Hmm.
probably before the 90s, during before the Japanese bubble period ended, um, studios had direct relationships with TV stations, and so TV stations would um, hire them to make anime, right, for their programming. But at the time, studios still had some control over the intellectual property of the anime that they produce. Um, After the bubble burst, there wasn't as much money in the anime industry, and it was considered a risky sector to enter, and so we ended up having producers that are not studios kind of pull money into these production committees, and then they would go out to hire the studios. From then on, in the last 20 25 years, production committees have gotten stronger and stronger because oftentimes by controlling the copyright and the intellectual property, the profits of the anime titles themselves, when they become successful abroad, those profits only come back to the production committee. The production committee um, oftentimes don't pass those additional profits back down to the studios because the relationship between the committee and the studio is more of a upfront transaction. I've commissioned you to produce this, and this is how much I'm paying you to produce this series. That's starting to change again, where its pendulum is probably swinging a little bit backwards because um, there are now studios that have gained a lot of power and um, are part of bigger entities. Now they have the ability to invest in their own works again and have some say in how much cut of the royalties that they get from the production committee.
And how about you mentioned before the streaming services like Crunchyroll? How about the dynamics of that part of the business? In other words, is it kind of equivalent to Spotify and what it's done?
Yeah, the streaming services have changed the dynamic in that streaming services are global, and so they're not regional, right? Before streaming services came around, let's say during the DVD era, um, anime companies needed to go out to each market to license out those titles individually, working with licensees in each country separately because each country would have a distributor. A DVD distributor in US would be different from DVD distributor in Europe, in the UK, for example.
Mhm.
Um, but now with streaming services, you have uh, players like Netflix and Crunchyroll that's global, and so when you suddenly then have the ability to negotiate with just a single entity to be able to distribute your titles all around the world. Um, and so that becomes then a question of, okay, is there exclusivity in these contracts that are signed with streamers, or do they still have the ability to um, distribute these works to other other licensees, whether that's a DVD or Blu-ray, or whether it's a non-exclusive agreement to streamers. And the reason that's important is because someone like Netflix that has thousands and thousands and thousands of titles in their catalog, their specialty is not anime, and so they may not have the ability to market all of the titles that they license from the anime producers. Nowadays, you have 300 more than 300 anime that's produced on a anime series that's produced every year, and so no one company has the ability to market all 300 titles at the same time, and so streamers have to pick and choose which titles that they market. Um, or and that becomes a problem for producers because they all want all of their titles to succeed, but they don't necessarily have the ability to do that when um, you only have a few streamers that control the global market. And so um, that's where there's kind of a pendulum swinging back and forth, where you'll see announcements where streamers sign new contracts with studios because they get exclusive rights to anime titles. But then you still have producers that are still signing more regional licenses where they want a more targeted approach in a specific region, for example.
All right, this is complicated. And since starting Animenomics, what have you learned so far, or what has changed your opinion about what direction you should go in the future, if anything?
Yeah, that's one thing that I've been paying attention to recently is there's a lot more. I think the discussions around anime video content by itself is as a lot of the conversations that were had, 5, 10 years ago is still being those conversations are still being had today. And so a lot of those there are still open questions on whether it's good for the industry to work only with streamers, or um, can they still succeed with physical media in certain markets. I think those are still some of the questions that are still being asked. But new frontiers that I think are starting to become more important is in the area of anime merchandise, because
Um,
historically in the international markets, what was popular is primarily the video content, or the print content if it's a manga, right? People want to be able to consume these works as entertainment. Now we're reaching to the point where it's not just anime and manga aren't just forms of entertainment, but they're collectibles. They're things that people want to have, to collect, to be able to display as part of maybe their identity, or to be able to connect with other anime fans around them. And so uh, the topic of merchandise and what is the best way to bring anime merchandise abroad? That's something that um, I've seen in the last couple of years become a bigger question than how do we distribute um, anime content globally. I think producers have kind of solved, and they know that anime is popular globally, so it's not a question of can I bring title XYZ abroad. Well, obviously they can, because there will always be an audience for this specific type of anime. It's more of a question of, if I produce merchandise for this title XYZ, who abroad can make it, or who someone abroad can, um, sell it, right? Who has the expertise to be able to market and sell that product abroad? So that's I think what I've seen in the last couple of years, and it's an area where I'm still trying to learn a lot about, because uh, I've never worked in retail. I'm trying to figure out what does merchandising and retail look like in a lot of different um, countries and parts of the world, because each of those parts of the world have different retail markets. Retail consumption is very different than entertainment consumption, where entertainment now is more global, retail is still very, very much local to those regions.
And the biggest players then from Japan would be what, Bandai Namco and Good Smile?
Yeah, Bandai Namco is one of the big ones because they have a lot of properties and they make a lot of toys. For example, they make a lot of the Gundam robot plastic models. Those are big sellers abroad, and Gundam is starting to not. Historically, they worked a lot with distributors in specific countries. They didn't deal in abroad, going abroad directly. But now we've seen that Bandai is starting to open up stores abroad because they want to be able
Yeah,
to sell them directly and keep the profits to themselves.
I got it. And which markets are being targeted as the biggest growth opportunities now?
Um, Surprisingly, I think some people, a lot of times, I think people would think that market like North America is mature, but I think anime producers still see North America as kind of a growing market. They know that it's the
Mm.
easiest to get into, and um, because there's already traction, right?
Yeah.
People already know what anime is, and the U.S. being a big consumer market, people will buy anime products. Um, but there are also emerging markets like Latin America, Southeast Asia. Those are, I think, two of the most um, two of the fastest growing markets at this point. And then you have more frontier markets like India and the Middle East, sub-Saharan Africa, where the market may not be as well developed, but there are pockets of core fans in those regions that can help popularize. And if the product is there, it's likely that they will buy those merchandise.
And with not just the merchandising, but the actual titles themselves, is Comicon, for example, the primary conduit to reach fans, literally directly face to face?
Um, Comic conventions, to some extent, yes. So in let's say in the U.S., for example, uh, comic conventions these days have kind of started to incorporate more anime and manga, and so they're not restricted to just American comics or non-Japanese comics, and so those comic cons are trying to maintain some of their market share so that it doesn't get taken away by the more anime specific or manga specific conventions, because you have a convention like Anime Expo in Los Angeles that's grown to 400,000 turnstile attendees a year. Um,
Wow.
and then San Diego Comic Con is 3 weeks later, right? And San Diego Comic Con is still heavily around American popular culture titles, but you've started to see more manga publishers go towards Comic Con. Some anime publishers go to Comic Con. Um, yeah, outside of the U.S., you also Comic Cons weren't that big of a thing, but the anime and manga conventions have become popular. Southeast Asia, you see a lot of these
Mm.
um, anime and manga conventions. We're starting to see more pop up in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, um, and we know that in East Asia, anime and manga already has traction. They've been popular for decades, and so there isn't as much of a need to say intensively market in East Asia because the consumer base is already there. Um, Anime and manga is just all present in East
Yeah.
Asia.
Okay. Great. Hey, I'm glad how global this discussion is shaping out to be. And that is a good segue because we already have some questions, which is terrific. Let me read one of the questions. And by the way, you can ask for a friend. We won't necessarily read your name unless you want us to. All right. First question. Is the production of the content mostly overseas still, or have suppliers popped up specifically serving Western markets? So, in other words, suppliers from not Japan? You addressed a little bit of this, but maybe you could go into more detail.
Um, I'm not sure what production this is referring to. I'm assuming maybe merchandise,
Maybe, yeah.
or the video content themselves. So I could talk about both of them. So video production of anime is still largely the core production
It's
pipeline are
merchandising.
still merchandise. Okay,
Merchandising.
merchandise.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so let me talk about video real quick. So for video, the core production pipelines are still in Japan. There are still outsourcing that happens to foreign countries, China, South Korea, as I said earlier, but growingly Southeast Asia. For merchandise, I would say um, a lot of the merchandise is still produced in East Asia.
Mhm.
Historically, Japan did produce a lot of their own merchandise, but um, some around, I can't remember the year now, about 10 or so years ago, um, Japan removed tariffs on toys that
Mhm.
are imported into the country. And so we saw a lot of merchandise, Japanese anime merchandise production shift to China. Um, and so a lot of the products that the anime merchandise that you see today are made in China. Um, and then, obviously, then Japan brings them in and then sells them to distributors abroad. It doesn't go directly from China to abroad. It goes through Japan first. Um, and but now we're starting to, rather than Japan signing multiple distribution deals abroad, they're starting to establish their own overseas subsidiaries so they can import them themselves and
Mm.
sell them directly in those overseas markets. That way, then they get to keep their own royalties. They don't have to. They don't. They get all of the sales revenue back for their own parent company, and that's one of the bigger. That's one of the bigger goals of the anime industry right now is how do you capture more percentage of the overseas revenue so that they come back to Japan rather than staying abroad.
Got it. That's great. Good questions. Please use the chat to put in any other questions or comments. Also, we've got some positive comments in here. Thank you. Let's shift gears just a little bit, talking more about Animenomics and how you go about getting information. You're a practitioner of one, right? I mean, you must have a large network of people that provide you with information, but how do you go about curating the information, obtaining the sources, and then producing or your editorial process? Tell us more about that, please.
Yeah, so let me talk about I guess the logistics first. So I publish Animenomics every Wednesday, most Wednesdays, something that I take a break, obviously. Um, and so I spend a lot of Mondays, Tuesday nights, sometimes Sundays as well, just to do research on what are the big stories that have come up in the last week and the last few days to be able to decide what stories should be reported on. Um, I probably in that process gather somewhere between 10 to 15 stories that I think are interesting, at least to be able to highlight. From there, then I try to decide, okay, which ones are bigger than others, which ones are worth explaining in more detail and perhaps need more context. Or if it's something that's underreported, because
Mhm.
um, today there isn't any outlet that reports on the anime and manga business consistently. A lot of times the
Mm.
reporting is based on what is the new title that's coming out that
Mhm.
may be going to be popular. What are the new anime adaptations that are coming out? What are the new manga titles that are popular in Shonen Jump, for example? Um, but I want to go behind, kind of below that, and the underlying stories. Okay, if an anime series is popular, um why is it popular? Let's say a title like Oshinoko from a couple years ago, for example. It was popular in Japan, it was popular abroad. But who's really driving the popularity? What kind of readership was it in Japan and abroad? Um, who are the producers that are that publish the anime and the manga, and what impact are they seeing in their businesses because this title is so popular? Those are just kind of the stuff that I look for. Um, as far as sources, uh, there are plenty of publications in Japan that write about anime, and so there's no shortage of sources, fortunately. Um, but it's more about finding the ones that don't just report based on press releases,
Mhm.
because I think the Japanese news industry a lot of times rely heavily on press releases, and
Yeah.
I try to, you know, they're useful sometimes, but I try not to overly rely on them. So I look for things like um, uh, financial earnings announcements, or
Mm,
um, anime industry journalists who are experienced and maybe write columns regularly. I try to pay
mhm,
attention on what kind of things they're talking about. Um, there are uh, industry groups that publish data on a regular basis. Like I said, the Association of Japanese Animations, which is the anime industry trade group. There is a publishing industry trade group that looks at not just manga, but the broader publishing market. They produce data on a quarterly basis, and so as I identify those, I try to figure out, is there a regular schedule? Do I need to carve out, every quarter I need to report on this, or is this something that's more of
mm,
a one-time thing, right? Um, and if it's regular, then that's good for me because I can have an editorial calendar where I look at, I'm expecting this report to come out in the next couple of weeks. I should prepare some time to read the report, or I should prepare space in my newsletter for that information. So that's kind of the general
mm.
outline.
And I know this is certainly easier said than done, but have you been able to develop any primary sources of, let's say, like industry insiders? Of course, I imagine language is a little bit of a barrier, but how about that? You cultivated some of those sources?
Yes, I've been able to grow them a little bit slowly. I try not to overextend myself just because I'm mostly running Animenomics by myself. Um, but in the last couple of years, I've been attending conventions and events
Oh,
just to be able to network with executives in the industry, and coming to realize that some of them read my newsletter, right? Obviously,
cool.
as a Substack writer, we see the subscribers that come into our publications, but sometimes we can't tell because an email might be a Gmail. It's not a corporate email address, and so you don't know who your readers work for. Um, and but finding that they read my newsletter, and so perhaps I would get introductions to other people, and there then I build more connections. um, the hard part, I think, is even though I developed some of those first level connections, I still have to build the relationship, and probably a little bit of the explanation why reporting on the business is important, and why these people and these companies, why it's in their best interest to be a little bit more open of
Yeah.
talking about their own business, right? Because obviously they're used to, um, outside of Japan, working with publications that want to promote the manga or the anime title itself, but not about the company itself. But I'm here to
Yes.
tell the story about the company, and
Mm,
so building those relationships, as you know, with Japanese companies takes a little bit longer, and I've started to get some traction where a couple companies are interested in me interviewing them and providing coverage.
mm.
But slowly over time.
Yeah, well, you're heading in the right direction. And all right, I'm been dying to ask you this directly. I know we could exchange emails, but the two of us are literally among like the only people that I've found that are using what's called Smart Brevity, which was kind of coined by the founder of Axios news service. It's a style that if you're familiar with either Animenomics or Real Gaijin, you'd notice right away when we break things out into simple chunks. Uh, Tell us about why you adopted this and how it's going.
Yeah, so I've been a reader of Axios for a long time. I thought it was a very effective way to kind of communicate information. Um, for me, I think in the anime news world, there isn't a lot of newsletters. I guess weren't very common when I started. You see a lot of independent publications out there that are producing more feature style or blog style articles. Um, More prose and paragraphs, right? And so I wanted to do something a little bit different. Just plus, for me, writing a newsletter, I thought, as a newsletter, because it lands in people's emails, I think it should be readable more quickly. I thought Smart Brevity is a good approach, and I try to follow the axioms, but I'm not a journalist by training, and so I try to do the best that I can. And me being the writer and the editor, I probably could be more concise than how I write today. But I try to experiment a little bit where the primary newsletter is probably in the Smart Brevity format, but there are other long form articles that I've started to introduce in the last year just to be able to go more in depth because
Mm.
um, the way I want to produce my newsletter is that, on a weekly basis, like I said, I compile 10, 15 stories a week. And so the most effective way to report on those stories is um, the Smart Brevity bullet point format where you could explain things very quickly and without getting lost in blocks of text, right? But if I want to go deeper into a specific company and be able to explain their strategy or have an interview with a studio executive and to be able to understand, why are they making certain business decisions that requires more explanation that can be done with bullet points, that's where I start to kind of looking more into uh, traditional long form articles.
Great. Well, I completely hear you and agree with you because I've kind of adopted the same approach. For anyone that's interested to learn more about Smart Brevity, just do a YouTube search. The founder of Axios has a great TED Talk on Smart Brevity. It's like 6 minutes long. Absolutely worth it. This is a great communication style, not just for newsletters. You can use it for anything. All right, that's great, Richardson. We'll continue to work on that. Quick shout out once again for all of the people. We got quite a few who are listening in today. If you have a question, comment, please put it in the chat, and we will continue to monitor that as we go. Uh, Shifting gears once again, maybe let's focus a little bit more on like the industry overall and future trends. You've already touched on some of this, but where do you think anime, manga are going long term? What are some of the big trends that you're seeing?
Great question. It's probably different directions that anime and manga are going. Manga, I think, has manga has been, popular in abroad, I think, for some time, and but manga has its own challenges domestically. In the
Ah,
domestic manga market, Japan being a shrinking population country, there at some point there's going to be a cap on how many people are going to be reading manga and how many people are going to buy manga. So we're starting to reach the point where it's not just there's as many consumers who will read mangas, and so the revenue will start to hit a cap, but also the number of people that can make manga. Um,
oh,
and so uh, we see publishers now that have started to look for talent abroad to not necessarily
oh,
make full manga by a foreign artist, but perhaps they will bring in a foreign artist who can draw um, similar to an art style that Japanese readers are comfortable with, and then pair them up with a Japanese writer, for example. That way,
Mm,
then you don't the publishers don't have to rely on someone who is both a writer who can create stories and someone who can draw. They can kind of split the work a little bit more. So I think that's we'll start to see that more often, and then a company like Kadokawa, who is a publishing giant, knows that this is happening, and so in addition to bringing in foreign artists, they're also looking at what are titles that are published abroad that they can bring into the Japanese market.
oh,
One that they're one market that they've started to look into this more is Taiwan, which has a lot of similarities to Japan. I think there's a lot of affinity for among Taiwanese with Japanese content, and then um, Japan with oftentimes going to Taiwan, and so there's a lot of connections between Japan and Taiwan. Um, so that's one area that they've started to look into more. So
interesting.
that's yeah. So that's the manga side. I think we just have to pay attention to what's the trajectory of the revenue of the manga industry, and what's the trajectory of the overseas market for manga, because manga piracy is still a big issue
Uh,
in that industry. For the anime side, obviously the question of what is the best distribution channel for anime
mm,
abroad, right? Whether it's through streamers or is it local streamers if those players do appear, or is it best to create a single platform that all anime is available? Um, and so that's on the distribution side. You also have issues on the production side where obviously the same talent concerns come because of Japan being a shrinking country. Do you have enough animators to produce all the anime that's in high demand, right? Um, Studios are starting to establish branches abroad where they can train talent abroad to help outsource some of the more manual tasks of an anime production. Perhaps the in between animation, the coloring. We have a company like Toei Animation who produces a lot of titles like Dragon Ball. They they've already said that they're going to looking to establish more branches in Southeast Asia, um, and so that creates studios have to be able to build a digital pipeline, and not just create animation on paper, right? They have to be able to have the infrastructure to be able um, to have an IT team that can create a seamless production pipeline across multiple countries. Um, and on the topic of digitalization, obviously, an emerging technology like AI is currently a big question in both manga and anime. Um, but the question of AI, I think, for the Japanese side, isn't really a question of should we use AI. It's more of a question of how do we use AI, because Japan recognizes that AI certainly, for all the ethical concerns of AI, there are certainly some benefits because it allows them to address some of the labor concerns that are in the domestic market. Um, and Japan as a country, there's a law that allows the training um, of AI models on material without considering them as copyright infringement, right? And so there
mm,
is already the legal infrastructure to be able to use AI, but the question now is more about, like I said, how do you use AI? And the main concern there is more about uh, s- f- should AI be able to be used just by an ordinary person to create content that's copyrighted. We saw in the last year, where the Studio Ghibli style of pictures, people could generate them using OpenAI, and now with OpenAI having a video model, you could create anime style and recreate Japanese anime characters in videos. Um, Producers don't like that because they see it as infringement on the rights of to be able to use those characters, right? Japan doesn't have a fair use doctrine in their copyright system like the US does. And so any use of um, intellectual property characters needs to be authorized by the copyright holder. So that's the big question. How do you balance the fact that fans obviously like to create derivative works of anime characters, and that's one way for anime to become popular. But how do you limit that so that there's not uncontrolled proliferation of uh, creation of characters without authorization? Um, so that's the I think the big question, because a lot of time, because these days especially, the AI companies are largely US companies, and the way they operate follow, US laws, right? And so they perhaps don't consider it as big of an issue, where Japan wants a more um, nuanced approach based on their laws.
Ooh, that is a big topic. I imagine you're going to cover that a lot for the foreseeable future. Now,
Yeah.
another topic that's related to this, I understand that, on the use of AI to help with translation of the actual words, for example, in a manga. I understand that only a small percentage of Japanese manga have actually been translated into other languages, particularly into English. Well, first of all, is that true? And if so, what is being done, like, to leverage AI in order to get more translations out?
Yeah, I'd say, I think there is some truth in publishers saying, only a small. I think they put it somewhere around 2 to 3% of all manga that's been
Oh,
ever published have ever been translated, right? There's probably some truth to that. I don't know if that number is accurate, but um, obviously manga, because it's published in a serial format, some titles
mhm,
reach into the dozens and dozens of volumes, right?
mhm,
Not all of those volumes have been translated, and their manga has a you know more than 70-year history, and
mhm.
so there are decades and decades worth of manga that have never been translated. um and so, again, I think for manga industry, it's not a question of whether they should use it. I think they want to use it because they want to be able to bring more titles abroad. Obviously, for manga, the the block the blocker here is to whether a translation can be produced quickly, and whether a title can be brought to market quickly. Um, Obviously, Japanese is a complex language. There are translators out there who are working their butts off to translate light novels and manga, and that's important because it's foreign publishers who have helped manga and light novels become popular abroad. Um, but the Japanese side wants to be able to uh, create more output more quickly. And right now, they're taking the shortcut of using AI translation. And so they're kind of taking a two-prong approach where, yes, they're still working with foreign publishers to get, translations, but they're also trying out AI. Is this a viable approach for titles that are not likely to, sell a million copies? Can they create a quick translation for something that's only going to move 100 copies and still be able
Oh,
to get revenue for that title? So that's where
wow.
manga companies are looking into using AI
And
translation.
there's a concern about using AI tools to do the translation leads to something being lost in translation, I imagine.
Yeah, and I think whether there's a mistranslation, I think that's an issue that the startups that are, I think is critical. I think it's important to know that the startups that are experimenting with AI translation aren't foreign companies. They're all Japanese companies. So they're
Oh,
all working. It's different than the anime side, where I think a lot of the anime production, anime experimentation with AI is happening both abroad and domestically. For manga, it's largely this experimentation is being done domestically. And so
hmm,
I think they're working within their own, legal frameworks within Japan on
ah,
how do you make this possible, right?
okay.
Uh, and I think,
Yeah, yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
they recognize whether uh, 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 readers abroad, there is some they recognize that there's some sensitivity to AI being used. So I think they're conscious of that.
Okay. Okay, good. Hey, this kind of dovetails into a question that we have here. I'll try and capture this. Well, it mainly focuses about graphic novels. Oh, why are they always out of print? Hmm.
Why manga are out of print. Well, I guess I'd make a question about overseas markets or domestically. Overseas, I think, I guess in the entertainment world, there's this concept of a long tail where, when you publish something, when you produce something for readers or audiences to consume, oftentimes you get traction, very early in the beginning. So the biggest amount of sales is going to be in the beginning. After years and years, you start hitting the long tail where sales start to decrease, and eventually, the cost of producing something is no longer worth it's no longer worth the cost because you're not getting as much return out of it, and so maybe they need to. For foreign publishers, especially, they're operating. They're not large operations. Oftentimes, these are
Hmm.
maybe a dozen employees or small publishers, and so they're having to um, focus resources on other titles. And those other titles are going to be the ones that bring them more money to be able to continue the business, um, to get bigger licenses. And so they have to reallocate translation resources towards those
Hmm.
new titles and not reprint older titles that maybe aren't as popular. I think for those titles that are older in the catalog, foreign publishers are, at least in the US, I think, are looking at how do we make them available in ebook format, in a digital format, to be able to, still have the title be available out there so that it can be available to readers if they want to access it. Um, and yeah, so I think that's what's happening in the
Okay,
manga.
thank you. Richardson, I can't believe it. It's already been an hour, so we're bumping up against our time. We could keep going for a long time. Yeah, you are really serving a unique offering here. I mean, no one is really doing what you're doing, so that's fascinating. Maybe we do have one more question here, and I do want to address it. You've kind of already touched on this, but maybe to finish out, you could leave us with your thoughts. Is generative AI the elephant in the room? Is it a serious threat to the industry? Maybe it's less of a threat, more of a tool, but what do you think?
Um, it's certainly an elephant. It's not. I think it's not the only elephant. I think generative AI, I think, will play a role in that. There are already companies that are using generative AI to create anime. Right now, the biggest experimentation is more around not creating an anime from scratch, but using generative AI to kind of fill in the gaps when you don't have enough people in your
Oh,
studio, right? So you can have still individuals who draw key animation manually, but then you use generative AI to fill in the in between animation. That's being explored. Uh, the use of generative AI for end to end production of anime, I think we're still far from that. Um, but if it does happen and it gains traction, I think there's probably going to be a splitting of different tiers of anime where you have the manually produced anime as being the core sector of animation, whereas the AI produce animation is going to be kind of a lower or second tier, not
Mm.
necessarily second tier being of lower quality, but it's anime adjacent because it's not, it doesn't follow the traditional production pipelines, but perhaps it'll draw new audiences to become more familiar with anime style, and then they will then discover the core anime sector and the traditionally produced anime titles. So I expect that's where it would go. Obviously it could change.
Okay, terrific. Hey, we have not just questions, but we have a very nice comment here. Great chat. Big fan of Richardson's newsletter. All right, you've got one
Glad to hear.
satisfied
Thank you for the support.
subscriber there. Speaking of that, so how do we find Animenomics? Where do we go?
So Animenomics obviously on Substack. I only publish on Substack. It's not just me. I'm also experimenting with hiring freelance writers to help me report
Oh,
from different markets.
oh,
Last year, I had a reporter based in Indonesia who to help me cover
oh,
Southeast Asia. I may be looking to for people who have experience with covering business and are familiar with the anime and manga industry to write about other markets, Latin America, Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's the thing that I want to do. Other social media where you can find Animenomics is X or Twitter, Blue Sky. I'm still thinking about whether it's worth posting on Instagram. Again, me being by myself, how do I
yes,
produce? I now have to learn how to produce visuals so that it can be posted on Instagram. So
I know.
yeah,
I hear your pain. Yes, me too. Well, that is terrific. And of course, we'll put right up. I mean, there are a lot of key takeaways from this, but I'll try to do my best to summarize that. And of course, put links to Animenomics and these other sources. Yeah, I got to tell you, well, very positive feedback, very informative discussion, guys. Thank you very much for listening and posing questions, being actively engaged. I kn This is a fascinating use case for Substack and
yeah.
why it's the one of the best ways to interact with individual readers. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to continuing to read your newsletter on Animenomics.
Thank you.
You
Thanks
wanna
for having me, Mark.
close it
Glad
out?
we were able to connect.
All right, well, please say, final thoughts to your, listeners out here and readers.
Well, thanks for the support in, reading Animenomics. I hope you can, if you find Animenomics helpful, definitely share my articles. And if
Mm,
you work in the industry, I'd be always
mm.
happy to hear thoughts and, to connect on what you're seeing on the ground as well.
That is a great message. All right, I'll add that into the final write-up. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating at Richardson Son. I had a great evening since it's still the previous day in North America, and I'll continue to follow you on Substack.
Great. See you around, Mark.
All right, goodbye.
お疲れ様でした。
Thanks for watching and or listening to another story from the Read My Lips series of podcasts on Real Gaijin. Tell us what you think and be sure to tune in again next time.